If you're using knowledge stacks with a local model and you feel like your local model is giving you responses where it seems like it's hallucinating or at least not really answering the question that you're asking of it, it's likely due to providing the local model with too much context. Many of the local models have a lower context limit, whereas if you're using an online model like ChatGPT or Gemini, Gemini has a context window of like 1 to 2 million tokens. So it is able to retain a lot of information and remember more during the conversation. Whereas these local models, their context limit, their context window is a lot smaller. And when you're using a local model with a knowledge stack, you're going to butt up against that context window pretty quickly, which means it's going to start just throwing out answers to questions it doesn't even know what it's answering. And let's take a look at what that might look like. I'm using Cogito right here, and I'm going to enable the Msty Studio docs, which is just a text file of the Msty Studio documentation. And I'm going to ask Cogito a relatively simple question. How do you use Safari with Msty Studio? And with this response, Cogito is at least telling us that the text was cut off mid-sentence. That is a little bit better than giving us an answer to some question that it doesn't even know what it is and it's trying to answer anyways. And if I expand the knowledge stack here, we see that with this question, there were 9 chunks that were queried. And with these chunks, there is a whole lot of context. So if you string all of this together, yeah, you're going to see how you could butt up against that context window limit for a local model relatively quick. So here are some pointers on how you can curb that and how you can have better conversations with your local models when enabling a knowledge stack. The first thing that we'll want to do is go to the knowledge stack and then click on compose settings for this knowledge stack. So I deliberately made this fill. I made the chunk size super big, 8,000 characters. If I go to the chunk visualizer, we can see that there's only 16 chunks. And look how much text is within each of these. So we do not need this much text, not for the studio documentation anyways. We do not need this much text in a chunk. So the first thing is let's have an appropriate size for chunking. That way our chunks aren't too big and also not too small. I'm going to close out of this and then go back to compose setting. And since I know the Msty Studio documentation, we can probably get away with using a lower setting, such as a 1,000 character chunk size. So I'm going to select that and then recompose. Okay, let's take a look at the visualizer again. Now we can see that we jumped up to 123 chunk, and then let's look at the chunk size, a lot smaller, a lot more manageable. Okay, and let's close this. And the next thing that we'll want to focus on is the query settings. Query settings, we want to limit the amount of chunks. So we made the chunks smaller, but do we need a max of 15 chunks for many of these questions that we'll be asking? Probably not. In fact, I think we could probably also get away with a lower number, and I'm going to select 5. And then I'm going to save out that setting, so that's the default query setting. And then I'm going to X out of this, and then let's go ahead and add a context shield to the bottom of this so it doesn't remember that context. And the next improvement I'm going to make is I'm going to click on the model parameters. And then I have numctx in here already, which is basically the context window. And then instead of 2000, which is really the default, so if you're looking at this, you might not see anything here, but a lot of the local models, they're going to have a lower number, such as 2000. I'm going to increase this to 10,000. And I don't want this to be too big because ultimately the bigger it is, the more context, the longer the conversation goes, the more my computer's fan is going to run, and I want to minimize that. Let's use 10,000. I think that's a pretty decent number to carry on a conversation. And then for each of these questions that I'll be asking, it should be more than enough to handle the context that's provided. So let's apply that. And then now let's just ask that same question, which is, how do you use Safari with Msty Studio? And with this response I just got, I could see that these configuration updates I made are working very well. So there's a drastic difference between the response I got up here where it says, hey, 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 there's a cutoff. I can't see all the context. And then down here where it's providing a good answer. And the only thing that I feel is missing is the mention of tunneling, which to counter that, what I might do is maybe increase the chunk size a little bit or even just allow a little more chunks to be sent over to the model. So let's try that real quick actually and see what kind of response we get. Okay, so I'm going to click on configure and then let's change from a low number of chunks to a higher number of chunks. And let's see if 15 helps. And then maybe let's increase the similarity threshold a little bit. And let's try these settings and see how well it does. I'm going to add the context shield and then re-ask the question, and let's see what kind of answer we get. All right, great. And it looks like I got a better answer because now it is mentioning the tunneling feature. Well, let's ask one more question. Let's just continue the conversation a little more and see what kind of result we get. Tell me about the tunneling feature. All right, and it gave me more information about using the tunneling feature. So I've been carrying the conversation forward. It's still retaining some of that context. So as you continue to talk to a local model, there's a probability that after a while, the context limit may be breached and it may be forgetting about stuff in the earlier part of the conversation. So I recommend for your needs, just continue to tweak the settings, ensure that you're using the appropriate chunk size to get the answers that you need without them being too large or too small, and sending the appropriate amount of chunks over to the model. And then the next thing, of course, is play around with the numctx value, get the context window at an appropriate spot where it's remembering enough of the conversation without it making your computer sound like it's going to fly away.